Alright, the next topic that we're going to cover is the topic of localization. What I would like all of you to be reading with regard to this topic is Chapter 1, in particular basically the second half of Chapter 1, starting on pages 30 and then carrying on all the way to the end of the chapter at page 43. It's a relatively short video. We're going to split localization into two videos. Let's start out with the objectives for this module. There's really only one. What I would like all of you to be able to do is understand what is meant by the term localization. In addition, I would like all of you to be able to give examples, in addition to what we give in class, because that's going to be a part of our discussion connected to this particular module. We're going to give economic, political, and cultural aspects or examples of the localization process. So let's move on. What is meant by the term localization? It is a term that is used less than globalization. In fact, my guess is that probably none of you who are currently enrolled in Geography 230 have ever heard of this term before. It is a term that is somewhat more specific to geography. So it's a part of the language and the vocabulary of geography, but it's pretty specific to geography. So let's move over and talk about exactly what we mean by this term localization. In a way, localization is the exact opposite of globalization. So refresh your memory as to what globalization means. It means the world is becoming a smaller place, where borders are less important, and where we have increasing levels of mobility of people, goods, commodities, ideas, and culture. Well, if localization means the exact opposite, basically, therefore, it also means the exact opposite of this idea of an increasingly interconnected world. So a really important aspect of localization is that, quite literally, people take a look around and they're somewhat frightened by globalization. They're somewhat apprehensive of what all of this means. And perhaps they perceive globalization to be a negative process. And so what they want to do is they literally want to rebuild the walls. Make the borders between the countries, if you will, more important than they have been under a regime of intensifying globalization. Another way of looking at this, then, is that localization is quite literally a response to globalization, where what we want to do is basically keep the outside world out. So let me give you two very general examples of what this process of localization might look like. There are a lot of people in the world who think that the current regime of international trade has winners, but it also has a lot of losers. Some people lose their jobs. For example, when a factory closes in Wisconsin and reopens in Mexico. If we had less international trade, so the thinking goes, then we'd be more likely to make things here in the United States, here in Wisconsin. And so there are people who are opposed to international trade and therefore opposed to globalization, because what they would like us to do is make more things close to home, whether it's Wisconsin or Nebraska or California. And the result then is that these people are basically making an argument that we need to localize our economy so that we have more jobs, that are family sustaining, and have relatively robust paychecks connected with them. Here's another example. Again, it's kind of a general example, and it has to do with immigration. There are, I'm sure, lots of people out in the world, here in the United States, or where have you, where there is at least controversy over immigration. People are fearful that the culture is changing too quickly. To give a more concrete example, let's talk about the United States. A pretty big share of the immigration to the United States comes from the Spanish-speaking countries of Latin America, and in particular, of course, Mexico. And that means that the United States is increasingly bilingual, and some people, of course, are somewhat apprehensive about that. And so what they're arguing is that we need to stop immigration, or at least lessen immigration, so that the population that currently lives here, who is foreign-born, can have a little bit more time to assimilate. So what they want to do is make the border more important than it has been in previous decades. And so both of these are kind of motivated by the same idea, that a world defined by globalization, by mobility, and by borders becoming less important is a world that isn't so good. That in fact maybe we need to address these issues and make those borders more significant. Now, I'm kind of putting a somewhat negative spin on localization, but it doesn't always have to be about kind of a reaction against things like immigration or international trade. There are other ways of looking at it. In fact, in some cases, localization is organized around this idea that we need to preserve some aspect of local culture, perhaps local traditions, or even the local economy. In other words, globalization is a process that creates really rapid and unpredictable change. And so if that is a situation that scares you, you might involve yourself in the politics of localization, because what you want to do is preserve the way things have typically been well into the future. So let's move on now and give somewhat more concrete examples of what we mean by localization. I've only got one more slide in this video, and what we're going to focus on there are the economic aspects of localization. Let's look at the economic aspects of localization. I have exactly 3 examples that I think fit this category pretty well. Let's start out with the first one. It says here, the reestablishment of tariffs. If you don't know exactly what a tariff is, let me explain. A tariff is an added tax on an imported good that the federal government puts on that particular commodity. So just to give an example, our government could slap a tariff on the import of steel manufactured outside of the United States. Let's say steel manufactured in South Korea or China. The reason that our government might do that is because they want to make South Korean or Chinese-made steel more expensive, thus encouraging suppliers and other companies to buy steel that is made in the United States. So the effect of a tariff is to basically bolster a local producer, perhaps here in the United States, and in this particular example it would be steel manufacture in the United States. What tariffs then have the effect of doing is making borders more important. They basically discourage the import of some commodity, and as a result you might think of a tariff as being basically a trade barrier. Whenever you argue in favor of tariffs or argue in favor of trade barriers, you're arguing from a position that basically is a really excellent example of the economic aspects of localization. There are, however, some other really good examples of localization. One of them is probably really typical. Increasingly, there are people all across the world, and in particular here in the United States, that are, especially during the summer months, shopping at farmers markets, as opposed to going to the Jewel-Osco or the Century or the Walmart, especially for their fresh produce. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people do that. Sometimes they do it for health reasons, because they are pretty much guaranteed that the vegetables that they buy at the local farmers market are grown without pesticides or herbicides. So they're basically organic. And you can't really have that guarantee necessarily when you're buying your vegetables and your produce from, let's say, the Walmart. So that's one aspect, but there's another aspect that's perhaps even more important, especially with regard to the example we're giving right now. When you go to the farmers market, how is that different from going to the, let's say, the Walmart? For one, the farmer that you're buying from is likely located very close to where you live. So you're pretty much guaranteed that you're getting locally grown food versus corporate long chain distribution systems that are common with, let's say, Walmart or Century or Jewel-Osco. Just to give an example, when you go to the Walmart, look to see where some of the produce comes. Bananas inevitably come from the northern part of South America, kiwis come from Australia, and a variety of other vegetables come very long distances and actually to get to the Walmart shelf. So when you shop at the farmer's market, you know that the money that you're spending is going directly into the farmer who lives in your community's hands. The money, therefore, is staying local. The profit is staying local. When you go to the Walmart, that profit doesn't stay local. What it does is it goes to the corporate headquarters of the Walmart Corporation, which is in Arkansas, a good 700 miles from, let's say, southern Wisconsin. As a result, there are many people who think that shopping at a farmer's market is superior because it bolsters the local economy. It keeps money in the community and thus produces more jobs in the local context. A similar kind of situation can be found here, and I'm hoping that this third example is something that all of us can relate to. You have a choice when you go to, let's say, the liquor store. You can buy a macro brew, i.e. Budweiser or Miller, or you can spend just a little bit more money in most cases and purchase a micro brew. One example is Spotted Cow, which is brewed right here in southern Wisconsin. Now, there's a lot of differences between microbrews and macro brews. One of them is the scale of production. Budweiser and Miller, they both have really large factories that produce a huge amount of beer on a daily basis, probably in distant cities. So in the case of Milwaukee, it's actually not that far, or I'm sorry, in the case of Miller, it's actually not that far, it's just Milwaukee. But with respect to Budweiser, it's St. Louis. And both of these big macro breweries have a global distribution chain, so you can buy their products all over the world. On the other hand, Spotted Cow, which is brewed in southern Wisconsin, is a really tiny, almost artisanal workshop-like scale of production. They only have a few employees, and they don't have the capacity to brew on the scale that Budweiser and some of the other macro breweries do. But another really interesting point is that when you buy Spotted Cow, you know that the profit stays in this part of the country. It stays local to our community. And so just like when you shop at the farmer's market, where you're bolstering the local economy, you're doing the exact same thing here. And so both of these then are basically a part of the same impulse. They're about localizing the economy and keeping the profit close to home. In the next video, we're going to address two other aspects, or examples I should say, of localization. We're going to move on to the political and the cultural aspects of this process.